the decisions that we've made in the past to implement those assessments and what they mean for our children and for our schools. I appreciate the Coalition's interest in providing this opportunity for everyone, and I'd like to begin by asking our administrators if they would, and teachers if they would like to introduce themselves. We'll start over here.
Hi everyone, I'm Angela DeVitro. I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning grades 7 through 12.
I'm Melissa Emili. I'm the Assistant to the Superintendent.
Bob Steckel, Director of Teaching and Learning grades K through 6.
Tracy Piazza, Principal at Forks Elementary.
Lisa Bowman, Instructional Support Teacher at Forks Elementary School.
I'm Dominic Buscemi. I'm a member of the school board and I'm also the liaison for the Community Coalition with the board.
And also joining us later this evening is Steve First. He's the principal at Eastern Area Middle School 7-8. He first had to introduce the concert that's taking place at the 7-8 building, so he'll be here shortly. Before we get started with the presentation, I just wanted to be able to share a little bit about the assessment categories that we're going to talk about this evening. I think the word assessment carries a different meaning to a lot of different people, but for us as educators, an assessment is a really necessary piece for strong pedagogy. And it carries a lot of different manners in which we use assessment. So that's what we'll discuss here tonight. What you see on the projected wall is 3 or 4 categories of assessment: diagnostic, formative, benchmark, and summative. This format is what is going to be projected for as we go through each grade level throughout the evening. And we will show then the examples that fall under each category. But just briefly before we get into that, I wanted to share what these categories mean. So diagnostic assessments are really, they provide us with specific information about students' individual strengths and weaknesses, but then also about groups' strengths and weaknesses, whether that be a class or a grade level. And then that allows us to modify instruction at either an individual level or at the classroom level. Formative assessments give us that in-the-moment feedback as to how students are progressing. Benchmark assessments, they provide us with information on how students are progressing toward the grade level standards. And then the summative assessments are then the information that's based on a student's mastery of the grade level standards. So as we go through this evening, you'll see this format for every slide that we'll put up, but we will also then have the examples for that specific grade level, and that's what our panelists will talk about. They will talk about the assessments that we use at each level, and then also the uses of them. At the conclusion of our presentation, we'll open it up for a question-answer period. I know Marissa has some questions that have been collected already, but we'll then open it up for a question-answer as well. So I will turn it over now to Tracy Piazza and Lisa Bowman. They're going to go through the K-4 assessments.
And we're going to start. Lisa is joining us as the practitioner. She does a lot of work with many of these assessments and then specifically with students. So she and I are going to kind of bounce back and forth a little bit in some of our explanations. I am going to start with English language parts for K-4. One of our predominant assessments that we use there is NIMS, and that stands for the Dynamic Indicator of Basic Early Literacy Skills. That is a universal screener. It is nationally normed, and it is out of the University of Oregon. So that is a test that is used across the nation, not only here in Easton, not only here in Pennsylvania. And it really came into play based on research that says that children should be reading on grade level by the grade 3. So this is one of the indicators that they have found that across the nation is a pretty good indicator of students' progress towards that on grade level reading by grade 3. They use grade 3 as the benchmark because when you talk about early literacy, and even in college terms of early literacy, early education, that's a K or pre-K to grade 3 education. So that's where that frame of reference came from. For us, DIBELS is given in our district at K-4 3 times a year across all 7 of our elementary schools. It's given in the fall, generally within the first 2 weeks or 3 weeks of school. It's given around winter time and then again in May. We use that for a number of reasons. Mr. Steckel and Mrs. Amelia had talked about for individual students as well as groups of students. This one is one of those tests that are used for both of those purposes. For individual students, we want to see where are they starting out with their skill set, their early language skill sets, early literacy skill sets. Talking about things like phonics, phonemic awareness, first letter name sounds, end sounds, vowel teams, as well as fluency, and to a lesser degree, comprehension. Comprehension is measured through the DIBELS assessment, mainly through a tool called DAYS, a subset within that test called DAYS. But I would say comprehension isn't the strongest piece that we're looking for through the DIBELS assessment. Additionally, we use that assessment in classrooms as what do I want to call?
For benchmarking
Progress monitoring. So if we have a student who is weak in a particular skill, maybe it's that first letter naming skill, then we'll continue to progress monitor that student or group of students on that skill so we see how they're progressing based on the intervention or the instruction that's taking place. So for that, individually we want to measure how students are doing and what we need to do to adjust the individual instruction. We also look at that globally to see where someone like Lisa Goldman, our instructional support teacher, our reading specialist, can come in and provide interventions for students. And we do that in a manner that students are getting the exact skills that they need, so that they're grouped together for that intervention based on a need, a skill set need. That's kind of the global. Anything else you want?
Just for the progress monitoring, the thing that's nice about it that you can share with parents, or I can use as a teacher, is where even if the child's below the benchmark, it does set an aim line so you can track the student and see where their progress is along that with the different skill sets. So it is an assessment that we use a lot with the students that receive reading support.
And what's really nice in the K-4 setting, there are 3 meetings that teachers attend a year in terms of a data team. So Ms. Piazza would have that information with her and would have it about each one of the students. A particular grade level group of teachers come in, first grade, let's use that as an example. So first grade teachers are sitting with the principal and any other support staff, and they're going to review the assessment scores, the DIBELS scores, for each one of the first graders in that school. This way, hopefully, no one, and I've heard this since 1980, falls between the cracks and we miss him or her and they're not addressed academically. So all the children are viewed. You take a look at them with the DIBELS scores. And because it is benchmark, and we also use it as a diagnostic tool, meaning look at the assessment and say, this is the problem that child has based on his or her answers on the assessment tool.
How many of you have been dibbled? How many of you have heard about the dibbles?
Your children come home and say something to you about it.
No.
And it's not, no. Because I think our attempt is to make it low stress. You may have to read a certain passage and we're going to time you for 1 minute, and that's really to address fluency. And we try to make sure that they're comfortable with the whole process so they don't get too nervous. And just find it as, you know what, this is part of your academic process between now and the time that you graduate. These kinds of things are going to happen.
And one of the things I will say there is, like any other assessment piece, it's a bit contrived. So it's not, you may have students who do poorly on one given day but do really well another day. Those are the types of things that we discuss at that data meeting. If I say, Lisa did really poorly, I'm surprised at that, we may want to go back and look, was that the way that we did the test? Was she anxious that day? Was there something happening that had her score particularly low on a given day? The other piece there is it does allow for us to demonstrate to parents when we have those parent-teacher conferences or child study meetings exactly where the students are dipping and falling or hopefully meeting and surpassing that aim line. So it is, it is a pretty good tool in terms of that early literacy piece of learning at the elementary level. The second one there that I'm going to talk about is GRADE. GRADE is relatively new to our district. That stands for Group Reading Assessment and Diagnostic Evaluation. And yes, I had to cheat on that one because we just say GRADE all of the time. That one came to us based on the Keystone for Opportunity, KTO grant, if you may have heard of that. That was an opportunity afforded to schools across the state of Pennsylvania, and Easton was lucky enough to secure that grant. part of that expectation of that grant is that, one, we have a plan on who are the target grade levels that we're addressing with that, and how are we going to assess the learning or the progress made within those grade levels. For Easton, we chose to target our pre-K through really grade 2 students, hoping that it then travels through the spectrum up through high school, but the targeted areas, that pre-K, really it's called birth, to grade 2. So grade is another form of early literacy assessment, assesses many of the same types of skills in the DIBELS, but there is an extension to that. So for example, in the grade assessment, they also assess rhyming skills. How well do kids know patterns within there? It assesses positional words or directional words. So for example, they may look at a picture and have to say, find the balloon that is above such and such, or circle the word. So it talks a little bit about those educational lingo that kids need to know when they're reading stories. If the teacher says it's the word above, do they know what that looks like? But that one is one that we use predominantly because it is a mandate of our KTO grant. With that being said, however, there is some really good information that is gleaned from that. But I would say that our DIBELS is still the stronger piece in terms of driving our instruction. We use DIBELS more than we use grade, but grade is another piece of information that we're using as we're looking at students and their successes within school.
Excuse me, Tracy, could you just share with everyone how much that KTO grant meant for Easton schools? Approximately.
Financially, I can't answer that question, but in terms of financial support and the support that it has provided to our schools, I think it has been tremendous. Those monies through our district have been allocated in a variety of ways. Some of that is for funding early literacy programs within our schools. Some of the summer or after school programs comes out of those grants. Huge initiatives with our Family Connection partner in terms of student readiness, registration process. All-day kindergarten is kind of flowing into that conversation. That's part of the impetus of why we're coming back to all-day kindergarten, because we recognize not only through our own investigations at school, but also through some of the lenses through the KTO grant, that's a missing piece for us, that students really need to be on benchmark at an early age, sooner than later.
We have it's a 5-year grant. We are going into year 4, and it's about $500,000 a year. Very competitive at the very beginning, and each year I sit with a few other people and we write to obtain those funds for the following year, and then we allocate those funds as what Ms. Piazza said in those specific areas.
The funds are allocated. Part of the reason for us to be able to renew that every year is because we've made a commitment to give that test and that assessment. Is that fair to say?
That is.
And so, so everyone understands that that piece of the assessment really helps us to demonstrate our commitment to the requirements of that program, which for us is a considerable amount of money and a considerable amount of support for kids.
And because that's a birth to, wherever we want to end that spectrum, birth to second grade, a lot of our preschool partners are part of this transition, if you will. They also have some assessments, whether it be grade or several other assessments that they're doing, and then we come together as an entity to see, what direction we're moving from there. The next one is reading foresight. You'll notice that foresight also will show up in our slide for mathematics. The foresight is a test that we give to students. There are opportunities to give it 5 times a year. We traditionally give it 4 times a year. This year, I can say at Fork School we gave it 3 times because of the winter and when PSSAs fell and what have you. That also is a test that will show us what students are expected to know over a grade level prior to being taught. So the initial one is a benchmarking test. What do we know prior to being taught? And then it is given periodically between that time period and May to see how much growth has happened on that particular set of skills. Our students in grades 3 and 4 at the elementary level take that assessment. The other piece of that is it is aligned with the Common Core curriculum. So it gives children an opportunity to see questions presented in a format that they may not in their everyday teaching. In terms of that, we do use it as part of our discussions, our data team discussions. Again, that's not our most critical piece because we know that students may do better or worse on any given day on that type of standardized test, but it is certainly part of our dialogue. How is Johnny doing today on this particular test? Are we seeing that continual progression? The hope there would be that your benchmark test, your very first test, is probably, we would love to see that be very high. That tells us that kids have a lot of great skills before that instruction even happens, and it means we can fly even faster. But traditionally, you would see that being considerably low because they have not been taught those skills. So then the hope is that we've gone from what we would consider a very low score, maybe a 17%, maybe a 20%, raising up into the 80, 90, 100% as the kids are mastering and learning different skills.
Just the one thing that I use as a teacher is I look at the students, not just the intervention students, but even the classroom students, just to see, because there are breakdowns. I can see specific types of questions that students are doing well with or questions that they're struggling with. So we can look at those reports with classroom teachers and say, okay, these areas in comprehension, informational text is maybe an area they're struggling with, but reading literature they're doing very well. So it also gives us information that we can use to help guide our instruction as well.
And I would say one of the really beneficial pieces of that is the way that we can capture the data off that particular exam, breaks it down exactly as Mrs. Bowman had just said. Informational text, inferencing text, poetry, comparative literature. So we can hone right into specific skills that kids are either flying on, and we know that we don't have to spend as much time, or come back and talk a little bit more about where the holes may be for an individual student, a classroom, or a whole grade level. The next piece that you see on the slide actually goes across, and that's classroom-based assessment. And what I'll say there is we also have, I'm going to lump two together. We have classroom-based assessments, and within that we also use a technology piece. So anything that is a classroom-based assessment, whether it's using a technology component or a paper pencil component or a teacher survey component, interaction, those are pieces that are created by teachers based on the curriculum that they are teaching at a given point in time. So those are assessing a specific skill that has already been taught. How did they do on that skill? As a teacher, do I need to go back and reteach that, or do my students master that particular skill? But the important thing to know there is that is very skill-specific, teacher-driven, teacher-specific, based on the curriculum being taught at a given point in time. So those could happen daily. They could happen weekly. That does not mean that it's a big, monstrous paper and pencil test. That could be simply as simple as listening into a student reading, and they're doing a running record, which is kind of tabulating how fluent they are in a particular skill. It could be the spelling that the student produces within a writing piece, and now the teacher's looking at, did they carry those skills into their written work? It could be some of the technology pieces that are listed on our district website that the teachers are using. An example of that, I'll get into that in math, might be Math 24. How rapidly can kids go through those skills? It gives the teachers the ability to kind of assign where kids should be working a little bit more. So those are just tools for teachers to keep track of the learning and keep really track of their own teaching habits. What do I need to go back to the teacher and redesign, redo for certain students or groups of students? And the last big one on this ELA slide is, of course, PSSAs, and that is our summative assessment. And you all know that that is a state mandated test that's given across the state based on the common curriculum, Pennsylvania curriculum and district curriculum, that it is to see how well the students master those skills at a particular grade level. Again, one indicator at a point in time. So while it is very important for schools, for a district, for you as a parent, I also caution you to be, from being overly alarmed by a given skill, because it is one snapshot, one point in time. It is not how they traditionally learn. You don't traditionally sit down and read and then have to answer a bunch of questions on a piece of paper. So while it's good indications, it's not the only. It's certainly not the end all be all of indications for us.
And I think for us as educators, we use the other assessments that we've discussed here tonight because we don't use that as the sole indicator of students' progress. So we're using these other types of assessment throughout our daily practice to make sure that we are looking at everything along the way and not just using a single indicator.
And I think when all of those indicators align, a student is doing very well across all of those indicators, you might be able to say that's a pretty good, pretty accurate assessment for that particular child. When there's skews throughout there, then you have to question, was it the assessment? Was it the way the assessment was given? Was it the child on that particular day or moment or night? So that's why we kind of look across the board of all these various assessments. And we're going to switch to math.
Oh, sorry.
That's already in.
Mathematics at the elementary level, you're going to hear some of the same terminology that we just talked about within the reading component. Some of your big pieces in mathematics that you will hear about. If I start at the top there, math quarterlies, I'm going to kind of quick highlight and then come back to them. Math quarterlies, math fluency, math pre-test, math post-test. Those are our big assessments within the scope of mathematics at the elementary level. I'm going to go slightly out of order from what I have in there. If we talk about math pre-test, that's talking about the grade level test, very similar to what I said for foresight. The pre-test is testing what they're expected to know by the end of the grade that they're starting in. So if they're a second grade student, for example, that pre-test is saying, what do I already know within that second grade curriculum? What as a teacher can I skip for this particular child, move a little bit faster for a particular child, or do I need to really make sure I hone in for a given child or group of children? So that is, again, it would be wonderful if kids score very well on that, but we're not expecting them to score really well because they have not been taught those skills just yet. The math quarterly then, if you go back to the top there, that basically is your marking period, final exam, if you will, everything that they've been taught in the marking period. Please go ahead.
I was going to say, what that does is whatever is taught within a particular marking period, the students take that assessment at the end of the marking period, and that is an assessment, unlike the pre-test where they haven't been taught. These are the skills they have been taught. So we would expect and hope that the students are doing well on that because they have been taught those skills. But again, if a student isn't, it's also a good tool for teachers. That way you can go back and say, okay, these students didn't get this particular skill. We're going to make sure that we review that. And then once that habit, hopefully you can continue to move forward and build upon that.
That's also a test, again, like the DIBELS or some of the other ones that I spoke about within reading. When we come together in our teacher data team meeting, that's one of the tests that we'll talk about. How does the group of students or individual students do on that particular test? Is there a pocket of learning that was identified across the grade level that we really need as a district or as a school need to do better on? Or is there a pocket of kids or an individual child that can go faster, go slower? So that is one of the pieces that we talk about quite a bit within our teacher meetings.
And that one, our teachers design it. Math quarterly, math pre-test, and math post-test, our teachers design it. So if you have a second grade teacher, a group of teachers who designed that second grade math assessment because it aligns with what's taught. The first marking period, second, third, and fourth. So that is generated in-house.
Consistent across all schools, or?
Yes.
Consistent across all schools, yes.
Yeah, they are the same across all 7 schools. What I will say is that they are looked at every year. As we look at our curriculum each fall, then that team of teachers come back together, look at the assessment. Does it still align with what we're teaching? Did we tweak our curriculum and now therefore need to tweak that assessment? Is that assessment still needed? So the beauty of it being designed in-house is that we can change it as we need to, but it is universal across our 7 schools. Universal in the format, the test itself, and also when we give it. We try to give our benchmarks pretty much within the same week's time frame, maybe a 2-week time frame. Often we'll give a window saying from March 1st to March 15th, somewhere in that window we want you to do the math quarterly, so that we know kids are being assessed within a specific time frame, so therefore the data is a little bit more reliable. The math fact fluency, that also is something that came out of discussions with our math team, our math teachers, as well as grade level teachers. That really is measuring how quickly students like reading fluency, how quickly students can do their math facts. Certainly more important that children know the concept behind their math facts. Can they figure out how to add, how to subtract, multiply, divide? We would much prefer that students are competent in the concept than be very quick at it. But if they're competent in the concept and can be quick at it, then that leads into a little bit better mastery of some of their math skills as they have to read through some of those questions and figure out the multiple steps that are there. But certainly if they have concepts and no fluency, we're not as alarmed. If they have fluency but no concept, that's a little bit more alarming because their rate of accuracy is usually not so high. That test is typically a 1 or 2 minute time test on whatever area of mathematics we're talking about. So addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. Most of the time kids know that they're being timed, and the teachers do get to know the students, and some will just kind of hide the clock or look at the clock on the back wall because they know that that's a piece of apprehension for children. And they'll just kind of say, oh, you did enough, and stop there, or they'll let them go and just kind of note they were on question 17 to see what they're doing. Again, we're looking for that upward trajectory that they're improving each time, but again, the concept is a little bit more important than the fluency. Anything there? Math foresight, similarly to what I said for reading, it's available to us 5 times a year. We typically will do it 4, again, 3 to 4 depending on the year, when PSSAs are given, the weather, and all of those types of things. Really, again, that benchmarking test to see what skills do they know prior to being taught, and then we expect to see an increase in growth as we give that test each time.
I was just going to add, just like with the reading, how you can pull the specific skills, you can do the same thing for math. How are they with numbers and operations, geometry, various areas. So again, we can use it, within the various areas to group the students to see, what the students know, where they need extra practice, and, what skills they already know so that they can continue to move forward.
Backing up just a little bit, I see one of my notes here. The fact fluency, we do that 3 times a year across the district, across all 7 schools. That, however, also kind of wraps into one of those classroom-based assessments as well. Teachers do that often with students as just tick it out. How many can you do real quickly? Just an ongoing assessment for students to see how well they're doing. But as a district, we're looking at that 3 times a year to see that continuous progress. Again, the next one that's listed there are classroom-based assessments and technology-based assessments. And I would say the same thing that those are teacher-made assessments specific to the instruction that's happening in current time. So if we're talking about division, those assessments are going to be related to division. If we're looking at multi-step problem solving, those assessments are going to be related to how does the student break down those multi-step assessments. Again, it could be paper pencil, it could be computer-based, it could be observational with the teacher. And I'm going to ask Lisa to talk a little bit just because she's more familiar with it. The 2 very specific technology-based ones that we use at the elementary level are Math 24 and Fast Math, but then we also have the full host of apps and supports that are on our district website. But I want Lisa to talk a little bit about Math 24 and Fast Math, again, because as a practitioner, she's a little more familiar where the kids navigate through that.
Okay, Fast Math is not spelled incorrectly. There are 2 T's on it. I always point that out because people often think it's spelled incorrectly. This is basically a math facts program that students can access only in school, so they can't do it from home. Students often say, can I do my Fast Math at home? But you can't. But it basically tracks the students' progress. You can actually print out a graph to see the facts that they've mastered. The component that plays in here, there is a time piece to it, so if a student, we know they know their facts, but they are staring off or whatever, that does kind of, affect their score. But the nice thing about it, teachers can, okay, we're done with addition, we know you know your facts, okay, maybe your graph's not completely filled in, but I know that you know it, I can move you into subtraction. Or, even a student who maybe, really in the grade level we're focusing on addition and subtraction, but you know what, we're going to put you in multiplication because you're there, or even division, things like that. So it's nice. Or even for a student at a grade level who might be struggling and needs to go back and work on their addition or subtraction, you can really tailor to the student's needs. And also, like I said, you can get a printout to see how they're doing. Even though they're on the computer, you can still kind of track their progress with that. Math 24 is also first in math. The names are kind of interchangeable. That one students can do from home. Starting in second grade, they get logins for that. So all of our children across the district have access to both of these programs. Fast Math starts in first grade and Math 24 in second grade. Your students all have a login, and it usually has some kind of funny name, with it, like a number and a funny name. And then a silly name is like a password, could be monkey or banana or all different types of things. But they can actually choose the math skills. They can do all different levels. There's a K-2 world where that focuses on those primary math skills, and it goes on from there. The program, the one thing I love about it, it's constantly growing and changing. They're constantly adding things. As a teacher, I can't restrict them in the way that I could with fast math as far as your subtraction or your multiplication, but you can say go in know and show, which is like a problem-solving area, or go into one of the just the facts to work on your math facts, or there's facts gyms, and the kids earn stickers. They're really motivated by that. Their little pictures change, so it's highly motivational. But what I always like too is they're doing math. You can go in whatever area you want, just practice your math skills, or try to work on this. It's nice. They can do it at home. You can see it. There's also a family link component, so if you want to play with your students, you can go onto the family link, so you're not going onto their personal number and playing on their number, but as a family you can play. So it's kind of a nice piece that we have in our district that really can engage you, your families, as well as at school.
And then if you look across at the last area there, summative area, we have our math post test. That is the identical test that was given as a pre-test. And again, that's teacher created, district created, so they can adjust that as the curriculum grows within the district. And again, on that pre-test, we're expecting to see some scores that are relatively low because they haven't been taught that. The post-test is almost like a final exam. So all the skills that have been taught all year, we would expect hopefully to see some pretty high scores on that, showing that they have mastered those particular skills. Again, if the scores are maybe not as high as we wanted them to be, we as a team have to come back and look at that. Was that a specific deficit of that particular student? Was it the teaching style of that particular skill? Is it something that's a trend across our school or school district, grade level? So that is part of the reason we use that test as well, to see how well our students really progressing through the curriculum that we're expecting them to accomplish. Math course I've already talked about. Math PSSA, very similar to what I said at reading. It's a state assessment. It's given at grade 3 and 4 at the elementary level. This year it was three subtests, so 3 days long. Very challenging. We're eager to see how the kids did, just because it definitely was very challenging. One of the things that we noticed this year were a ton of multi-step problems, which was a little bit new. Not necessarily in our instruction. We knew it was kind of coming, and we talked about that in our instruction, but definitely new compared to what kids were used to in previous tests that they took in third grade. I would say kids are troopers. Some kids that certainly get anxious about it. Some answered very quickly, and is that a good sign or a bad sign? We don't really know. But bottom line is, we as a school want to look at how their students are progressing through our curriculum, and we want to use that as one piece of information. It's not the end-all be-all, it's a snapshot in time, but it certainly is a relevant piece as we're looking at our curriculum and across the grade levels. The other piece that's on there, maybe one that some of you are familiar with, maybe one that you have quite a bit of questions about. That's the Accelerated Math Placement Test. And that is one that I will say that we discuss every single year as to the value of that. Does it still fit in with what we're looking to do? That test is predominantly given to our 4th grade students in talking about how they're going to transition into 5th grade. And that may happen again at other levels, but at the elementary level, it's for 4th grade students transitioning into 5th grade. That test is given to a select group of students based off, and I know that some of the questions parents have, do your foresights determine any types of placements, or KSSAs determine any types of placements. This is one time that those pieces of information are considered. Typically, we look at the 4th January, foresight piece of information as well as all the other assessments that have happened, their quarterlies, their pre-tests, whatever has happened along the way. We are looking for kids who have excelled throughout the year in the majority of the concepts. Those students are then identified to take what they call the Accelerated Placement Test for Mathematics. Currently, what that is looking like, and you can certainly correct me, but currently what that looks like is if they went through that piece and as a school we identified this is a really strong math student, they would then be looking, we would be giving them the foresight from 5th grade, as well as a curriculum-based assessment designed by 5th grade. And if they did very well on those two skills, they may be put into an accelerated track. Basically, the purpose of that one is to look at do students have enough skills that we really can accelerate, move forward out of a group of instruction into a higher level instruction, whether that be still on a 5th grade level or whether that really be moved right into a 6th grade piece of curriculum. So that is one that, that I'm sure that there are some questions out there about that, and it is one that we discuss pretty frequently as to, is there different ways, is the way we want to do this year. It's certainly a yearly conversation. And the last slide for elementary, until some questions arise, we just have it listed here under other. And we did that because as we were talking about this presentation, the assessments, the big assessments, probably the ones that you're most interested in are the reading and the math and the writing that we just talked about. But the reality is there are other assessments that exist out there. If your students are in a social studies class, there are some curriculum-based assessments that happen based on the content being taught. If they're in a science class, there's some curriculum-based assessments that exist teacher-made based on the content being taught. Similarly, technology. There are pieces that will lend itself to science, to social studies, that teachers use as part of their assessment, part of their instruction. The other piece that we didn't want to leave out and didn't want to get bogged down in either is that any curriculum area, in phys ed, there are some assessments that happen, whether those are physical assessments or whether those are actual test questions about health and wellness. In music, there may be some assessments that occur, whether it's on an instrument that they're playing or whether it's their depth of knowledge within that curriculum. So across any given instructional phase at the elementary level, there are quote-unquote assessments that are happening daily, weekly, to gauge teachers' teaching and students' learning. Do we need to backtrack on any given area? So we didn't want to leave that out. The other piece of this that we wanted to touch upon, of course, in 4th grade, our students also take the PSSA for science. And so we wanted to make sure that we weren't missing that piece. And I would say the exact same thing that I said for reading and math. It's a standard, the state's assessment for science. It starts 4th grade, the first year that it's given. It's a 2-day test or 2-section test, typically at the elementary level, so that we're not bogging students down. We've given 1 section at a time. So this year, it was a little bit changed format. Reading, English language arts, that was 4 tests. We gave it over 4 days. Math were 3 sections. We gave it over 3 days. Science, there were 2 sections. We gave it over 2 days. And we have traditionally done that, depending on, regardless of what the format looked like. So they are taking that science PSSA as well in 4th grade. The other 2 pieces that are listed on here are our WIDA test, which is an ESL language proficiency test. So any student who comes in as a second language learner are assessed on their admission into the district, really, so that we're not missing that piece of education for them. And based on where they fall within that proficiency range of that English language test, they'll receive some specific services for those needs. And the other one is the NNAT, and Nick, if you want to address that, just because I know I'm not going to say the first word right,
Neglieri. Yeah, it's a nonverbal test that we use as a universal screener in grade 2 for all students to see if they should be evaluated for gifted education. So as a school district, we're responsible under Child Find to ensure that any student who should receive gifted support services receives them. So we use this as a screener for all students in grade 2 to make that determination as to what students need to move forward for a full evaluation. Now that doesn't preclude any family or teacher for referring a student prior to or after grade 2 for gifted education evaluation. But this just helps us ensure that at grade 2, we're making sure that any student that would be eligible for those support services can receive them. And we actually moved this year to this test because it assesses nonverbal instead of, we used to use the old set, but this assesses nonverbal skills. So students that are English language learners and may have different cultures, those students don't have to use language in order to perform on this test. So we can truly assess what their level is and provide necessary gifted supports, even so that language isn't a barrier.
We move to 5-6.
And I think a lot of what you'll see as we move through 5, 6, 7, 8 in the high school, you're going to see a lot of similar assessments. So we won't necessarily go into depth for each of them if they're the same, but we can hit on those different ones.
When you think about reading, there's a hierarchy of skills in order to learn how to become a fluent reader. And really, it begins with phonemic awareness, and that's really the sounds that you hear. That's why you hear in kindergarten, we often talk about rhyming, first sounds, ending sounds. And if you move up the continuum, probably the most difficult skill, and the skill that we're still learning to this day as an adult, is comprehension. Vocabulary and comprehension. So what happens when you get into 5th and 6th grade dibbles, you're going to be looking at things like fluency, how fast you read, and how accurately you read, as well as there's something called days. Bottom line is it's a comprehension assessment. And how well do you comprehend a passage that you're reading? So in kindergarten, where dibbles is more about phonemic awareness, and in 6th grade, it's going to be more about comprehension, right? And understanding vocabulary. So that takes care of the first 2 diagnostic assessments.
Is it okay if we object to the names of both of those tests? Dibbles and days, it just doesn't seem right to me. So come up with a different name.
Mr. Reiner,
Yes.
once you own the
Does that mean
company, you can name it what you want.
The students are dazed when we test them, I guess, and we're dibbled when they're dibbled when we dibble them.
Are they acronyms?
Yes.
Yeah.
DAYS is something that just stands for, it's a comprehension component. And it's a specific way in which the comprehension is assessed. The students read a passage, every 7th word is missing. It's really an odd kind of thing. And then the 7th word that's missing, there are 3 choices. And the children have to select a choice. And basically, they select a choice based on what they glean, the way the direction of the passage is being written. So it is an interesting piece. I have to trust the research that's behind it. That's DAYS.
Some of you may know that as a closed procedure, when you're missing a word, that's another name for it. And another one, similarly, if you remember, dating myself a little bit, those Mad Libs where you had to fill in the missing blank, those you were trying to create silly, obscure stories. This is a similar type task, although you're expected to fill in the correct word, so it makes sense.
Reading foresight is no different than what Ms. Piazza had shared with you, again, given in grades 5 and 6 at a specific point in time in the school year. Just like what you saw in school when you were in 5th and 6th grade, there are those classroom assessments that are given whether you're the reading teacher, the math teacher, science, or social studies. Phys ed, it really doesn't matter. There's classroom-based assessments going on all the time. I'm going to make my way across. There is one that's probably we have not yet addressed. It's called Gates and McGinnity, and you'll see it under the benchmark assessment, and that is given to 6th grade students, and I'd have to get out my cheat sheet for Gates and McGinnity. It's a reading comprehension assessment given to 6th grade students, and it's used to assist with the placement of students when they go into 7th grade. It becomes one of those pieces of data that is being used to place children in 7th grade. I know Mr. First would be able to address that probably more clearly than I could. Reading foresight, again, is summative. Let me see, ELA, PSSA, and WIDA, which has already been addressed. So that would be ELA in the area of 5-6. I'll address any math ones in the area of math at the 5-6 level. We have math foresights, again, given in grades 3 and 4, given to students in grades 5 and 6. You have your classroom-based assessments, and then just as Lisa was talking about, you have your Math 24 fast math activities that will be given to students Make sure we have there. Yeah. Math foresight curriculum, that doesn't change. Accelerated math placement test. And again, the same thing is given at the middle school to some of those students in order to place them into the appropriate math class as they move on through 7th and into 8th grade. I don't know if there's... Go ahead, Alyssa, you have
No, I was
something
just
on
going
that?
to say, if
Go
you
ahead.
read down to 5-6.
That really sums up, it's really a continuation of what we're doing in K through 4 and just carried into grades 5 and 6, and it just becomes on a more comprehensive level, and it really goes through the continuum. So if in 3rd grade, if you're learning a specific math facts, by the time you get to 6th grade, your math assessment questions are going to be a little bit more comprehensive than some of the state and 3rd grade math assessment.
The only thing I would interject there with DIBELS as well, when we talked about that fluency, particularly at the 5-6 level, it's true at the elementary level as well. Like I said with mathematics, where we want students to be able to read quickly, that's not in place of being able to read accurately with comprehension. And sometimes that's a misperception because one of the tests in DIBELS is how quickly do you read. And we would love to see children reading at, say, 94 words a minute, but if they don't have a single idea what they've just read, if they're word callers, we call that, then they're really not reading, because that fluency piece really entails the comprehension piece and the accuracy piece as well. If they're reading quickly but missed 20 words, are they really reading, really reading that quickly? So I would say that's a big strand when we hit into 5-6. It's certainly important at the elementary level as well, but when you talk about that DIBELS and DAYS, that's really what they're looking for, that total package of fluency, quickly, accurately, with some comprehension.
And it's just as important, listening to all of this, and your mind is starting to become mushy. The most important piece is that a group of people look at all of the children. You can call it a data team, you can call it a child study team, it really doesn't matter. It's looking at a child, the assessments she has taken, talking to the teacher who knows best and deals with that child every day before you rush to judgment about any specific child. So it's a compilation of the assessments that you see here, as well as conversations with teachers, curriculum-based, whether they're diagnostic in nature, benchmark in nature. It's conversations with adults that really come down to make sure that we don't miss any of those children that may be struggling, and we don't miss any of those children that need to be accelerated.
Mr. First not being here yet, we're going to transition to the high school. Ms. DeVitro will talk about the high school assessments, and then we'll kind of move backwards when he gets here for the 7-8. But I think what's really important is everything that we've heard so far from an elementary standpoint, from a 5-6 standpoint, they're assessing the skills that are necessary, those foundational skills, for students to be successful then when they reach the high school level. So this really is a true progression of looking at what we know students need in order to be successful at that 3rd grade level, at the middle school level, at the high school level, and ensuring that along the way we're providing the students with the necessary support so that they can be successful when they reach this level.
Let me just ask, are you familiar with the Keystone Exams? Kind of, yeah, I see a lot of elementary parents here.
Yeah.
I just want you to know that class of 2017, according to the state, is required to pass the literature Keystone Exam in biology, Keystone Exam, and the Algebra 1 Keystone Exam. So from 2017 on beyond, those children have to pass those 3 exams to graduate. At this time, yeah, because they may be having more, or who knows if the state will change their mind. Anyway, I wanted to let you know that at the high school level, because those exams are extremely important, the CDT is called the Classroom Diagnostic Tool. That is a diagnostic assessment given right now currently twice a semester. At the high school, we're on block scheduling, so we have semesters. So each class, the classes are they're approximately 80 minutes, 90 days. Does that make sense to everyone? I just want to know it's quite different than elementary and middle school. So we do provide those assessments, and that actually drills down to the weaknesses of where our students are for biology, literature, and algebra. That helps our teachers drive their instruction and provide remediation. If students are doing extremely well, can accelerate in the classroom. So that's really for our teachers' lesson planning and to provide direct instruction for those students. So that's what those three CDTs are for. Then we go on to the formative assessments. Formative assessments, just like they are in elementary and middle school, we have formal and informal curriculum-based assessments determined by the instructor. You can have projects, you can have technology-based assessments, you can have quizzes, you can have tests, etc. It's just at a high school level. And then we go to benchmark assessments. We have the Scholastic Reading Inventory, Read 180. Have you ever heard of that program, Read 180 or System 44? I think that begins at 5 to 6 building, if I'm not mistaken. That's actually a reading intervention. By the time our children reach high school level, we typically assume most kids can read, but a lot of them have difficulties. Some are actually reading at 3rd grade level, 5th grade level, 8th grade level, and maybe in 11th grade. We do have struggling readers. We provide these students with the SRI, we call it, and that tells us what grade level those children are reading at. It can give us information for our English teachers as well as our Read 180 teachers who actually teach the program. And that program is individualized for the student needs. The same thing with, Scholastic Phonemic Inventory. That's for our ESL population. It is a program called System 44, and that's for our English language learners, and it is the same basis as the Read 180 program. We have oral reading fluency, ORF. Has anyone heard of ORF? We have Mays, Days, Dibbles. ORF, oral reading fluency, is testing our students for how quickly they can read the words off of the page. And as Ms. Piazza said, it doesn't mean that they comprehend everything, even if they read quickly. And Mays is actually for comprehension. That's another assessment, benchmark assessment, to see how well our students are comprehending what they're reading. Okay. Summative are end of the semester assessments such as the Keystone Exams, as I explained, any final exams, unit assessments, and the WIDA is also provided for our ESL students to see how they are comprehending the language.
Could you explain, as far as the Keystones are concerned, do all students have to take the Keystone, or, well, let me rephrase that. All students are expected to take the Keystone.
They are.
So,
And it's a course completion test. So they take it at the conclusion of taking biology or
Right.
background.
but English learners are taking the same exam as other students in the classroom.
English language learners,
Mhm.
they are required to take the assessment. It's difficult for some of our students. If they don't pass the Keystone exam, they have to try twice. They are provided a different alternative assessment, which is called a project-based assessment. I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, but eventually you'll so.
But if I
they
could,
are-
I'm
no,
sorry,
no, go ahead.
if I could just stress at this point an inherently objectionable facet of all this is that English language learners are taking the same exam. Their entire future, high school future, if you will, rests on that exam, and our powers that be, at least at this point, haven't said that there should be an exception made for those students in the category. So that when you think of the Keystones, and I guess PSSAs as well, right?
Yes.
When you think about the standardized testing experiences, think about schools in urban environments where you have a high population of students who are just learning the language. And you see or I hope you would sense the frustration that we feel with many of these experiences in testing. They are horribly discriminatory. That's just the one area that I can tell you right up front. Horribly discriminatory. And why that continues without it being addressed is beyond me, which is one of the reasons why I keep bringing that out when people ask me about testing, is that It's very sad to think that in this day and age, with all we know about children and learning and rightness and the wrongness of what we do, we continue to perpetuate some very illogical and inappropriate practices with certain populations of children. I think the same could be said for students who are, especially in our elementary schools, but students who are coming from homes where you don't have a lot of books, where the language, even English language, isn't spoken much. To me, can be very prejudicial in many ways.
And I think one of the themes that I've heard this evening for the assessments that we as a school district are opting to utilize to help our instructional practices, one of the words that you've heard a lot tonight is individualized.
Yes.
And so what we're choosing to use to drive our instruction, much of that is we're able to tailor instruction individually then to students. But then when you look at the summative assessments that we must use per the state, those tend to be less individualized. So I think what we've talked about here tonight, there's really two different sets of assessments. Ones that we must use, and they oftentimes are then used to kind of label us as a school district or as schools. But then the assessments that we're using on a daily basis through our practice, that's what we see a great deal of value in to be able to help ensure that your children are receiving the skill sets that they need to be successful as they progress through their education.
Yeah, that's a good point. What the number of tests helps us to not recreate what unfortunately is being done on a generalized, widespread manner across the state with the Pennsylvania Department of Ed. You know, we're not. The more tests, the more indicators we have, the better we are at being able to determine what's best for a child. So, thanks. Yeah.
Well, actually, we'll take a step backwards now. Mr. First can go through the EAMS 7-8 assessments, see if anyone that you know is given at a different level we've already probably talked about, but if you want to talk solely to the ones that are specific to the 7-8 building.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, and I'm late because I was at a concert. Our students were not being tested this evening. They were being very summative in their approach. But they asked me to play a piece with them. That's always fun. The problem is, I said, can't you get it up closer to the top of the crowd? So thank you for your, just the indulgence for me being late. One of the things that we do at the 7-8 building that I believe is different than maybe the high school is we use what they call common formative assessments. And I'm sure you heard earlier that formative gives the teacher an idea of just how well we are progressing toward our goals. And those stated goals happen to be the state standards. You know, the very things that we are tested on ultimately by the PSSAs. We're also tested on them through the Keystones. So I know people say, everything's about testing. Well, everything's about trying to prepare students so that they can show that they understand the standards. So we have what we call quarterly assessments, which show how well we are progressing through the curriculum itself. We also have what they call study island assessments, which are linked right to the PSSAs. And I'm sure those of you who have students in our building this year have had the nightmare of dealing with the Common Core study island, which is new. It's a lot more difficult, but we're kind of working through that right now. But it does give us a pretty accurate indicator of where our students lie. Now, some parents say, no, that's not true, because at night after they fall asleep, I have to wind up finishing them. But, we all know that there are times when, children feel overwhelmed by these assessments. But I can tell you that we do them because they really do offer us an opportunity to know how well your children are progressing through the state standards. So we use the formative approach, and then obviously what you're all accustomed to, and I am too, was when we were in school, we obviously had the unit assessments, we had the quizzes, which are also formative, but we had those unit assessments. We now have the PSSAs, which I know are becoming more and more controversial. And those are summative, where we see how they really wound up learning everything that we tried to, in fact, teach them. One of the other things that we use to help to diagnose problems with our students is the Stanford Diagnostic and also the Gates-McGinnity, which are two tests that measure the comprehension of reading in various ways. We also use, I'm sure you already talked about Read 180, something like that. Those are also courses to help us get students that may have some problems in certain areas to get them to actually to be very much more proficient in their reading. Because let's face it, without reading, they're not going anywhere. So we know that that is something that we have to take very, very seriously. So we use the diagnostics. We also use the benchmarks known as Maze. I'm sure maybe you heard that earlier. We also use the oral reading fluency. But that's mainly for students that are really struggling so that we can help them to get into a regular reading class. Some of them also are then moved into Read 180. But those are diagnostic and benchmark tests that we use. Most of our students, though, are being tested regularly in a formative manner with Study Island and also those quarterly common formative assessments. And obviously, we certainly have teachers giving quizzes all off and on, too. So there obviously has been an increase in testing, but I just want to make it clear, and I don't want to go over my time, but one of the things that we have seen trend from the year 2002 when the PSSAs kicked in to now is that education has gotten a lot more scientific. There were the days, and I think you all can remember those, where you could have a teacher in the same department reading the same curriculum and teaching it vastly differently. And we certainly want to have teachers continue to have the freedom to approach instruction in creative ways. But we also know that they weren't always learning the curriculum, and we didn't have a lot of ways to check that as administrators. These are ways for us to be able to check instruction, and then to also, as you heard, change instruction as we move throughout the year to try to address children that have certain deficiencies or didn't learn things well. So the science of education is being married to the art of education. And that's what we're kind of struggling with right now. It's still new. Even though it might be 10 or 13 years old, in education, that's not old, all right? So we certainly want you to understand that we're not here to torture children and test them incessantly, but we're finding various ways to test them and to get a more accurate picture than ever before on what they're actually learning. And again, one of the things that I know we're all frustrated with is we've had PSSAs for 13 years, and we finally have gotten used to that format, and we were starting to make progress with that, and then all of a sudden, we shift gears, and now they have a new way of doing PSSAs that incorporates the Common Core. In time, we will also have that worked out well, too. So everything right now is still evolving with how PSSAs are actually given. They were much more complex this year than I've ever seen. And I must say, in a positive way for the 7-8 building, a lot of our students said, yeah, they were tough, but I think we did well. So that's the good news. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you. I think we can turn it over now and open it up for a question and answer. Now, if anybody wants to raise their hands, or if we can go over some questions that are submitted, but I think Debbie.
All right, so I'll go first. I guess we'll start at elementary. Where should we start? The most recent and work back.
Doesn't matter.
All right. Well, let's start most recent and work backward. So, since it's been a long time since any of us took a standardized test, are there previous copies of the test that we could see to see what the format looks like? Like how it, you said it's so much different this time than last year. Well, we don't know what that means.
They don't necessarily release full tests. So could I hand you the test that we took this year or last year? We cannot do that. But what the state will do is release test items, typically via the internet. They don't mail us a booklet saying here's some released test items. But typically via the internet, we can find released items which were formerly used items or sample questions that may be used coming forward. And that's that really can be found just by Googling PSSA formally used assessments. That's probably the best source of
Mine's only
information
in
for those types of questions.
second grade, so I'm not going to even worry about that because by the time she gets up there, it'll be
It
different.
may be changed.
Okay.
However, I think what your question's a good one, your observation, if you will, because I'm sure you don't ever recall principals shaving their head or somebody standing on a roof spending the night if people their scores are high, and the emphasis in general on achievement and on doing well in these tests has risen to the point where, you know, we are incorporating test prep rallies and all kinds of things. So it is a totally different atmosphere for testing than what we as kids in school would remember.
So,
Tricia, do you want to add something?
I just wanted to add,
Yes.
if you go to the Pennsylvania State site, it has all of the release tests for every grade level for all the years they had them. So you can see sample tests. That's what we use as teachers. We go there, print out the sample test that gives us the answers and has questions so we can see how they're going to word it. So you can see the previous years. They're all there for every grade level.
okay.
And they actually have student samples there. Like I print out for my third grade class, I print out student third grade answers to questions, and they get to be the teacher and like grade them like a 3 or a 2 when we go over like a rubric of writing, and they like reversing the roles, and you can see all that too. And it's real student samples. So.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
So this is
Stevie Trump.
so you mentioned that contrary to what people might think, you still have a lot of struggling readers
Yes.
in the higher grades. Are there any numbers on how long these struggling readers have been in the Eastern Area School District, or like is it predominantly people that have come in, like new language learners? Is it, you know what I mean?
We can certainly track each student individually and figure out if they came into the district in 8th grade and they were struggling, or if they've been with us since kindergarten. And typically, if there was with Easton since day one, we have provided a lot of interventions for them, obviously, as you can tell. But I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but I'm sure, you know, we'd have to go to individual schools and try this.
I mean, I think it would be interesting. First of all, you're I respect you a lot for saying that, you know, because
A lot
who
of
wants to
people
say
think,
that?
well, they think, you know, you're in high school, you should be able to read, and that's just so not.
Right.
We have a lot more struggling students in reading and math, and like Mr. First said, science, that if you can't read, you
Yeah, you
struggle
can't do anything.
across all subject areas.
Yeah. So I mean, the point is being, people might be quick to criticize, but when they look at the reasons behind, in fact, why
There's
is
a lot of everything.
There are definitely a lot of factors that may be, to some degree, socioeconomic in terms of what Mr. Reinhardt had said in terms of how many words are spoken in the home, that how many books are available, the modeling within the home. It could have to do with transient. We really kind of watch that as far as people moving in and out of schools, or even across our own 7 schools or 9 schools, you know. There are a lot of variables, and it could be truly a struggling learner that needs something a little bit different in their educational system, whatever that may look like.
Ms. Piazza, is there a chance, can you, I don't want to put you on the spot, can you relate just that piece of information you gleaned from your scores at Cheston related to population students, the observation that, or you know what I'm referring to?
Sure. Prior to being at work school, I was at Cheston for a number of years, and Lisa was as well. And one of the things that we often talked about are why are so many of our students struggling? What is, you know, the underlying piece? What we really found is a big factor. The underlying factor at that time when we did that research was the transient nature. In that given year, Cheston had approximately 550 students. There was a turnover of about 230 students, meaning that kids came in and went. There was one, in that given year, there was one teacher who had his classroom day 1 to day 180. Every other class had turnover with it. That was 1 student, 10 students, 20 students. The other piece, the underlying piece that we found there is Lisa helped me, we did a longitudinal study there to see the students who went kindergarten through 4th grade in that building. Majority of it, I don't remember the exact numbers, but majority of those students who were stable at that school were proficient in reading and math by 4th grade. The students who had a majority of the difficulties were because of our transient nature. Again, there are pockets of other reasons why kids struggled, but that really jumped out at us very strongly how impactful that transient piece plays within our students' lives. And chess is one example. You certainly can speak about that at Fort, you can speak about that at the middle school. Every single level, that is a huge, huge factor.
I think sometimes, people who do have a stable situation totally don't even think about these factors.
One thing that's striking me hearing this is the quantity of tests that are given, and I'm trying to understand, that there's philosophical things to think about there in terms of how the kid experience life, but I'm wondering in particular struggling to understand the difference between the math pretest and the math foresight, because they both seem to be pretests, and these are tests that I particularly struggle with ideologically, so that I know kids are getting tested on material they haven't taken, and my children are eager to please, and so they're going to work really hard to do well on a test on material they haven't been taught yet. And so I know that these are ones that are stressful. I'm hearing two sets of that, the math pretest and the math foresight, and I'm wondering if that's giving really different information that's needed.
Okay, I was going to say, for the math pretest, kindergarten does not take a pretest. That doesn't start until 1st grade. One of the reasons that we find it really beneficial is because there are those students who, in a particular set of skills, really know them already. So it's kind of nice. Like when I was in the classroom a few years ago, I taught math basically through grouping. So for each skill, I could look at it and say, okay, these kids know money, I'm going to do this with them. These kids don't have a base for it, so I'm going to do this. So it really allowed me to tailor it, and it is another assessment, and I totally get that piece of it, because there are kids that they want to please, and no matter how many times you say, I don't expect you to know this, there are those kids that still get upset, and that's a very real part of it. However, it is really good for guiding instruction, and that's one piece why we don't do it in kindergarten, but we do it in the other grade levels. The foresight is only given in 3rd and 4th grade at the elementary level, so K1 and 2 wouldn't have that. The difference pieces there, yes, they're both testing the same math skills. However, part of it is the presentation format looks a little bit different because the foresight is more aligned to what the PSSA will look like. So they're similar, yet still slight differences. And although our pretest is obviously the core standards as well, just like the foresight, the presentation manner is slightly different. And with the way we do our math instruction, I think as a teacher, it's a little easier to group right off the bat with the pretest, where the foresight, because a lot of the problems are multi-step and things like that, you can still group children, but it's not as easy off the bat as the other. But it does also guide the students that are excelling in particular areas as well.
I want to kind of piggyback off of what Rachel was talking about, the quantity of testing. And with 180 days still in the school year, if you start factoring in now all the instructional time that's being taken administering these tests, and then also factoring in the elementary level 2 weeks worth of half days, how is that balanced or accommodated, or have these kids just lost that time that they could have been either reinforcing what they need to know or learning something new?
It is definitely a challenge. There's no denying that, and it is something that we talk about often. What are the pros and cons of this? I think at this point the discussion really has been that the information we're gleaning from the majority of those tests is valuable in the instructional piece, which is why we continue to do them. But finding that delicate balance is definitely a challenge, particularly when we get into this time of year and doing those final assessments, because this time of year is just busy in general. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but it is definitely a balance. Do I think it's taken away from their educational opportunity? If I'm being very transparent, in some cases, yes, it is. We spend a good week and a half, 2 weeks assessing in the month of May, small chunks of time, not their entire day. But then we're also trying to gauge what we're doing within the rest of the scope of that day. What I will tell you is that we also try to adjust the schedule so that they're always getting each of the curricular areas. So on a half day, they're still getting math, they're still getting reading, they're still getting that instructional IE time. Is it ideal? Possibly not, but I think we have to balance that with the information that we're gleaning from it.
And I just wanted to piggyback on it. I think Tracy said that we do have these conversations as administration regularly and involve our teachers to make sure that what we are using is giving us the value so that we can continue using it, and we're not using something that isn't giving us that value. There are certain assessments that we have used in the past that we no longer use. I can think of the DRA, things like that it took too much time. It was too time consuming. So while we still felt like we got really good information from that, we've pulled back from using that and switched over and we're using DIBELS solely at this time. So we have those conversations to make sure that we respect that balance and we take that into account in our decisions.
I think part of the conversation too is not only looking at just the amount of time over a period of time, but also how punctuated is it? That if you have continual, I'm going to use the word interruptions, of what would be a regular schedule and a regular pattern, how often as a teacher do you have to kind of cycle back to catch up on things that you missed because you had to stop out and check this, and then stop out because you had a half day, and then stop out because you're doing this, and then we're going to go back to what we were doing 3 weeks ago, but you almost have to reintroduce and reteach it. And how much do the teachers get to kind of work and say, okay, what's the best way that we know we have a limited amount of days and a limited amount of numbers, but be at least interrupting, in that process.
It definitely is a challenge. One thing to keep in mind there is while the testing cycle, let's say DIBELS might take us 4 days, for an individual child it might be taking 4 minutes. Mm-hmm. So at the elementary level, we typically do that based on a team. So one of the teachers that it impacts tremendously is somebody like Lisa Bowman, who is one of our specialists, because she's part of that team. Our classroom teacher may be pulled out to assess her classroom. That may take 20 minutes. So even though it's taking us a week, it's taking that individual student 4 minutes, that individual teacher 20 minutes, so that class can get back on to teaching. But in the global scope of that, it's taking a building 4 days, 6 days, whatever that may be.
The one thing I want to add to that, because I'm also like a parent, I have 2 boys in the district, and I think hearing this presentation, from K to 12, there's a lot of assessments, but the one thing, even in the elementary level, like the grade assessment, only our kindergarten and first graders take that. Our foresights and PSSAs, it's only 3rd and 4th grade, so there's a lot of assessments here, but they don't necessarily involve every single grade level. And like Ms. Piazza said, you might hear of a testing window or it's DIBELS week or something like that, but the impact on a particular classroom or child isn't as great as it seems when we're looking at it across a school, across a district, things like that. Like some of those assessments at the secondary level, not all the students are going to take if they don't necessarily have a struggle with reading or aren't an ESL student, things like that. So some of that, while there's a lot of information, or even as a parent, I'm going, wow, that's a lot of assessment. But since I have a little bit more background on some of it, I can say, this child wouldn't take it, that child wouldn't take it. So it's kind of not understanding maybe what all of them are. It does seem like there's constant testing, and there are for particular grade levels, but it's not necessarily every student taking all of those assessments.
I just want to add, at the secondary level, we actually have pacing guides and curriculum guides, and those pacing guides and curriculum guides, the teachers actually mark when those assessments are going to happen. The administration determines with the teachers when they're going to have those assessments, and we put that in the pacing guides so that they know exactly what they need to cover. We're going to get the assessment during this time, and then so they pretty much plan it out. I know it's a lot of testing time, but it sounds like it is, but it's pretty well planned to cover everything.
The key word is strategic here, because what's happening is hard for us to relate to, those of us who've been in school before this data collecting business started. Is I think that, we think, geez, all those days, and you think back in school and how the teacher moved along, but as was mentioned here tonight, things are so different now in the classroom. The planning, the instruction, and ultimately, I hope, the learning is different, so that time is better used. it's more strategically used because teachers know a lot more about the kids. So the testing takes away time, but I'm hoping, as we all are, that we're all better users of time in the classroom, so that the lost time really is not going to be a major factor. I don't know how you determine whether we're being successful with that, but it's what you say is a concern we all have, no question.
I actually have lots of questions. Mr. Vitro, you said that every, my keyword here, every student must pass the Keystone?
There are certain students that are actually exempt, depending on if they have a certain disability. So that's determined by the special ed department and those case managers for those students. And that's actually, that information is.
Do they still take the Keystone?
They don't if they're exempt. That information, we follow what PDE states that we need to do for those students.
Okay. And you said every student must take the Keystone exam?
Well, if they're not exempt, they take the Keystone exam.
But that's not completely true. Because as a parent, you have the right to opt out of the Keystone.
You can opt out.
Correct. You can also opt out of the PBA.
And you can opt out of the PSSA as well.
Correct. And you can opt out of the PBA as well.
The project-based assessment.
Yes,
Well,
you
if
can.
you opt out of the Keystone, right, you can opt out of the PBA as well.
What is the school district's plan for those students that the parents opt out of the Keystone
As
and
far
the
as-
PBA?
What do you mean plan for what?
What is your plan?
In regards to
In regards to issuing a diploma to that student.
Well, that's a good question. I will tell you that I don't believe the district at this time, or I'm not sure that any district at this time really does have a plan for that small population of kids when the time comes. And that's a real concern because we're not sure just what direction to go in because we haven't been given some real direction on that. You might have seen in the paper where one of the superintendents in the Valley called it a mess, and I do think that that's an accurate description
A hot
of
mess
that.
would be a better word.
Pardon me?
A hot mess would be a better word.
So I think that that's probably an accurate description of that whole business. Because, again, I look at it in terms of fairness to a population of kids who don't have many advocates, and I think, well, that's terribly unfair to the kids who are learning English and taking Keystones, and they're liable to have to sit in school for 5 years until they can pass the Keystone tests. I mean,
But
if
you
think
are
about it.
aware at the same time that you, as the superintendent, have the right to issue a waiver to any student for the Keystone exam, correct?
Yes, I think that's fair enough to say. But I would also say that as superintendents of public schools, we're also under intense pressure to up the ante so that we've got kids who, when they graduate from high school, that diploma means something. And so at some point in time, what's going to happen is those superintendents across the state are going to have to say, all right, here's the line in the sand. Now you need to say, if you're going to give us the right to say it's okay to issue diplomas to students who are not participating, then you also need to make sure that we're not penalized for it and that kids aren't penalized for it as well. It's a very large gray area right now, I'm sorry to say. It really is.
I'm trying to gauge what direction our school district is going to go on this. I do know, and I am part of a large opt-out movement. I did opt out my child this year from the PSSAs. I will opt him out from the Keystone exams and the PBA. I'll put you on notice right now.
And that's
There is a group of parents who have consulted, I did not, with an education attorney, and this is what he said to them. It's a hot mess that the Department of Education has created for the school districts, that you cannot file a lawsuit to a school district based upon a perceived threat that they're not going to issue a diploma. What he will do is, as soon as the first school district refuses to issue a diploma, but the child has completed all the requirements for education, is he will file a lawsuit against that school district. That is what I'm afraid is going to happen to this school district. Are we prepared to go down that road like the I Heart Movie bracelet fiasco? Please tell me that you're not going to go in that direction and saddle the taxpayers with that kind of money.
I'd like to ask a question, if I may, because I'm trying to just understand as well. What is the basis for wanting to opt your children out of taking these exams?
I have my personal reasons, and I'm not going to discuss that with you, but Mr. Reinhardt knows why.
Since you're part of a movement, can you give me some examples of some of the reasons that some of the people in the movement are opting out? I'm just trying to understand what the basis is, because I really haven't heard much to justify why somebody would pull their child out from taking some of these exams, except for certain circumstances like an ELL learner who doesn't have the ability to read the test and comprehend what they're trying to take a test on, or a child that's got a disability. Aside of that, I don't get it.
Mr. Beecher, how are children placed in Read 180?
As far as in 7th and 8th grade in high school?
Specifically 7th and 8th grade.
Well, I'm going to Mr. First.
Steve?
Well, part of the criteria is to take a look at how they have done on the PSSAs. They're scoring below basic. They obviously have severe deficits. They're then allowed to take the SRI to indicate what their grade level actually is that they're reading on.
So for the child that scored basic and scored just slightly under proficient, there would be no reason to place that child in Read 180, correct?
I think a determination is made in cases where we're making those placements in the best interest of the child in order to provide them with the necessary skills that they have to be successful long term. So while you may be bringing up an individual situation, I think when we're looking at it globally, we're making those decisions based on what students we feel need the additional support based on all of the data that we've collected so that they can have that additional support and ultimately be more successful in school and or perform
so
on
you're not
state
looking
standard
at
tests.
what their grade was the entire school year.
I think
You're
one of
only
the things,
looking at the PSSA and that one little infinite part of time.
I think one of the
That's
things
a
that
flag.
Mr. First
That is a flag, and then we certainly take a look on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, so you have an AD student.
I think right now we're getting into a debate about an individual case. And I want to be respectful to everyone here this evening and just make sure that...
What is the cost per child for Read 180?
We've reviewed this with you.
Correct, but none of these people were here.
I think the cost that we look at is the benefit that it brings to our students based on when we're able to utilize a program that meets students' needs, and we're able to look through that SRI at their Lexile gains from point A of entering to when we're looking at dismissing from a Read 180 program, we're able to see what their Lexile gains are. And in that case, and when we're providing more support and intervention to a child, I'm not necessarily as hung up right now on telling you the cost per child because I don't have it in front of me, but I can tell you the benefit.
I have a question, with regard to the mandatory Keystone. Well, what's the incentive for students to take that Keystone if other students can opt out and still get the same benefit?
Well, incentive is that's an excellent question that I think we all have to ask. What is the benefit, and has been the benefit for this movement of toward high stakes testing? And as far as the student's concerned, there have been none. Now, because what happened there for a period of time, students were being given these high stakes tests. They were being forced to take tests, many of them that they couldn't pass. It was extremely frustrating. You had people just going through and filling in circles and so forth. And districts and schools were being judged and still are being compared to each other on these things. Now, what's happened is that attaching graduation to the Keystones now places those tests in a greater significance to all students. When they get the test, or let's say they take one of the assessments that we have here, which indicates they need help. What we say to them is, you've got to access this. You've got to take advantage of it, because if you don't pass these tests, you're not going to leave high school. You're not going to get a diploma. Well, you can leave high school, but you're not going to get a diploma. So I think the effort there to provide the incentive is attaching it to graduation. And so that comes now to play in this whole notion of, well, you can opt your kids out. What does that say? What message does it send to everybody else? And I'll tell you the truth, that's a good question. I ask that question all the time because I'm not so sure that we're on a path to common sense here. Again, we're taking a ride off in a direction I don't understand. Because, quite frankly, if it's got to be required for everybody, then short of those special populations and parents who may have a religious objection to it, for whatever reason, everybody should have to take it. But
I grew up in New York City. When I grew up, they had the Regents exams.
Yes.
Where you either got a Regents diploma or a regular diploma, and it was dependent upon whether or not you took the Regents and passed the Regents exams. Yeah. Is there any possibility of something like that, either within the district or within the state?
I don't think that's on the horizon. There are some places that give seals as well. And I think in Pennsylvania, some districts still give seals. In fact, if you graduate in a certain curriculum, you get a seal and you pass the test. But I don't think that's on the horizon.
I was just throwing the idea out because I know that some schools put a higher credibility on a Regents diploma as opposed to a regular one. And so that was one of the delineating factors where somebody can still graduate that may not have any aspirations to go to one of these schools that requires a Regents diploma. So they're not worried about taking the exams.
I think a couple of basic beliefs fall into this, and that's that the idea that all kids can learn more, that educators own the A's and they own the F's, and that data, the information we're collecting, drives what we're doing. And the other thing that I believe is a general statement that can be made is that the whole notion behind this is no matter what path in life you're going to take as an adult, there's a foundational amount of understanding and learning you need to succeed. No matter what it is, whether you're going to college, whether you're going to be a plumber, then that's what the Common Core, the standards are supposed to represent. That foundation of learning. So if you sort of look at all this through those beliefs, you may be able to process it easier. I don't know, with more understanding.
I just have a quick question. After all these assessments and testing, my son's in 5th grade, all these assessments and tests for whatever grade your child might be in, if by the end of the year they're not doing all, how many children are held back because they have not performed? Or is this just all a charade of get another test in? Because if it's not, it's one thing to do the intervention. Because my son has, he's in enrichment and he's also in Wilson reading. So he's benefiting from that special assessment for how he learns, which is great. But what about the kids who aren't up to the level? Are they just being passed through because they've taken all these tests? Or are they being held back and really, or summer school? Do they even have summer school anymore? I mean,
summer school is offered for students who are not passing the classes, not necessarily not obtaining the skills, individual skills, I should say. So some of these assessments we're looking at the individual skills that those students need remediation in. That may not necessarily mean that they aren't passing the class or able to pass the class. But that means that we need to ensure that we're addressing that skill set through an intervention. And that's what I think some of the assessments we've talked about this evening target versus those unit tests or things that are used to ultimately grade and then look at
But there has to be a
retention.
volume of information
There
that
is.
needs to be learned, not just concepts and all this stuff. I mean, there has to be hard facts.
Repeating a grade level is not viable for most kids. It just doesn't work. It has never proven to be the answer for many kids ever, anywhere. Repeating the same material over again for a year isn't the answer for most kids.
Majority of
Yeah.
cases.
So we've got to come up with other ways that we can unlock those doors to learning, and that's through Read 180 and some of these other programs that we have. And some of them are very expensive, there's no question, but because they require very specialized training, we have to send teachers for that training. But they also carry with them a pretty high success rate for us, which is good.
It's important to note, too, that these assessments that we use for data collection aren't report card graded assessments. They're for data collection purposes and then to focus the teaching and learning going on for that individual student. So not doing well on a foresight test doesn't hold you back. They all measure different things, but they're not placed on the report card or the averages. Obviously, if someone's really struggling, they're probably struggling in your classroom, too. That correlates. That's there. But the kids know that. It's not, when we give certain things, they know we're just, gathering information.
Yeah, I'm curious with this whole concept of opting out. What's the impact on the school district itself for all the students that do opt out? I don't know how many have opted out or will opt out, but is there a financial impact on funding from the state or federal or anything like that based on the total number of students that don't take the tests?
Well, we did get that number, and it's less than, I think it's less than 25 students opted out, or parents opted out for this year. What is difficult for us when kids miss tests or when they for whatever reasons and there's an opting out, what is difficult is the manpower needed to try to make up tests for those kids who are out. Because the administration of tests is now so super sensitive. The other thing is that the testing, the makeup testing for kids who are out for various reasons requires kids to miss that much more instruction, and that's not a good thing. But as far as opting out in particular, we have to provide them with alternative activities and have somebody there monitoring.
As far as one thing that we didn't bring up this evening was the change 2 years ago or so at this point in the way that we are now rated or looked at as a school district is the SPP, or the School Performance Profile. We used to be measured through AYP, Adequate Yearly Progress, and through the SPP, one of the factors that is looked at is participation rate. So if we had a significantly high number opting out, that would impact our participation rate. And then that ultimately impacts our overall SPP score. And then that could place us in a certain level of needing to complete additional school improvement plans and going through a great deal of
Oversight.
Involvement, yes. So
PD.
it wouldn't necessarily translate directly to lack of funding or withheld funding, but what it does translate to is an increased need of resources from within our current structure in the district allocated toward those efforts based on that SPP score.
So correct me if I'm wrong, if enough parents choose to opt their kids out for their own personal reasons, they potentially provide the risk of damaging our school district.
The years that are following their kids.
Yes, I would say that could possibly be a result of that. But again, in this day and age, it's a little bit hard to really say that yes, that could be at the end of that road, because at least at some point, if you have numbers of people who are opting out and those numbers are that big, I would hope somebody would ask the question, why? Why are so many people not electing to participate? What is it about this that offends so many people? Because people in general, I think, are very reasonable, and so I would hope to think that somebody would ask that question if that movement continues. Problem is for us is that we're into that whole theoretical basis of high stakes testing equals labels. And that's what it comes down to. It's very simple. We used to do it when we were in school. We used to give kids tests and then label them with something. And we were told very appropriately that you can't do that anymore. That's absolutely wrong. But then, not too long ago, the Department of Education and powers that be politically decided, well, that's the way we're going to change schools. If we label them enough and embarrass them enough with their scores and with their failure to have kids move forward, they'll change and they'll do better. But we saw with young children, it didn't work, and we're going to see with schools that in general it doesn't work either, because we've got kids coming to the school door who have a hard time finding 3 meals a day. It isn't like everybody comes to us ready to start in a race at the same point. So that's the inherent unfairness of all this. But there is this belief yet on the part of some, and I don't think this governor buys into it, that you change behaviors by labeling people. You don't do that. It just doesn't happen. It's wrong, inherently wrong.
Just to get back to your discussion about the opting out, less than 95% of the students, 95% of the students have to take the test in order for the school district to receive their funding. If we had 30 students this year in the entire school district who didn't take the test, I don't think you have to have anything to worry about. This year, I can't speak for what will happen next year or the year after if this movement continues, but it also has to be for 3 years. So
let me understand something. You're saying that the state is mandating that we give these tests. That the state mandates that we do these tests. But if the state doesn't require the parents to allow the kids to take the test, and the district is penalized if a movement like that takes off, and enough kids opt out, the district is penalized because of the actions of the parents who don't live up to that mandate. Is that correct?
That's the way I see it, yes.
Who made that rule? I mean, how is that rule, how can that be even logical? You're penalized for something you have no control over.
Yeah. That's right.
I don't understand that.
The school performance profile that was referenced, that SPP score, it's a rather lengthy formula, and a number of factors go in. The participation is a piece of the factor for the PSSA, but there are many other factors that relate to. I mean, again, there's a formula that all of that would go together. So I'm not sure. I didn't want to get into a number of people that would opt out before it affects the score, ultimately where your SPP score goes down. But there's so many factors. There's everything from advanced placement courses that are given in your high school, which give you more points, to how well your students do on PSSAs and SATs. The formula is rather large. So right now, school attendance, I don't think I would be concerned at this point, because I think by the time we get to a movement that's going to be that large, hopefully someone else will realize that we have a bigger issue than just that.
Exactly. That's troubling to know that you're at the mercy of someone else's whim to provide an education and the funding for the education.
When I look at that percentage, I don't see that to be an issue.
How much is spent per pupil?
In general?
per pupil in this school district? How much is it?
It depends. It depends a great deal on on once again the formula that you use to come up with that number. But it's somewhere between $10,000 and $13,000 a student. Now that's higher for special education students.
Yeah, obviously, I mean, just as
Considerably higher.
an average would be.
I think in general that's a fair.
What was the number you said?
Between 10 and 13 would be a fair. I think that's a fair number.
That's
to
excluding the increased cost of special ed.
Yes.
I think we can take another question or so. And then knowing that if you have any follow-up questions that you either didn't get answered this evening or wanted to seek further clarification on, that you can certainly, if you wanted to use me as the point of contact, you're welcome to do so, and I can ensure that you get to the correct person. But if we want to take one or two more questions.
Being that there's such an extension of additional testing going on, this test access, all these different tests I'm given throughout different times of the school year, has there been any consideration with dispensing with some of the other tests that are given throughout the marking periods and using these tests to suffice with just perhaps some quizzes, randomly throughout the marking period just to gauge performance throughout the period instead of losing additional days, for tests?
I think that's something that we do pretty regularly is assess the assessments that we're using. And then changes based on what we feel is still necessary versus what we think can go by the wayside. We do have those conversations regularly because we do truly value that balance and don't want to over-assess and not get us the information that we need. So those are conversations that principals are having. Principals are having them in their schools with their teacher teams, bringing them up to the central office, and we're regularly making those decisions. Any other final questions? Hand in the back.
A little different direction. I keep hearing the words data collection come up. I'd be interested, in the interest of student privacy, what happens to the individual data and who has access to it going forward. That, to me, is a very big individual concern these days.
The only people that would have access to any individual student's data are those with legitimate educational interest. So we have data that is maintained in the Dibbles site, but only the individuals who, and I'm using Dibbles as an example here, but only the individuals who have legitimate educational interest to that child have access to that child's data. So
does it go beyond the school district? Does the state receive that information?
Not with something like a Dibble, no.
Any of the data collection on an individual basis go beyond the district?
Anything that would go beyond the district will go as like a number, not a name.
Right.
And so that would be something like the PSSA,
Yes.
The grade assessment. Again, global information because that is a grant-driven assessment. So they get a global picture of what that data looked like. But again, not individual names, not even individual schools within the district. Just this is the global information of where we started to where we've ended. That information and that particular piece of information is then used to decide if they're going to refund that particular grant. But besides PSSA, really nothing is out there that we utilize.
Would you also like to explain to those here how the scores are now impacting teacher assessment, teacher evaluation? Somebody?
Our teachers are actually tied to our assessments with the PSSA and Keystone. Eventually, have you heard of PBOS? Yeah. The state is actually collecting the data for 3 years for English, math, science teachers, and the growth of those students are actually inputted into the teacher evaluation system now, as well as this school performance profile score that they mentioned. That's 15% of our teachers' evaluation, along with observation data and teacher elective data. That's another piece. So the data does now play a part in our evaluation system for our teachers, and it will for our principals this year as well.
That's a significant change in the way that public schools do business.
And that's a mandate from the PDE.
Yep.
Just a quick note, how do you feel like that impacts the teacher, for best, how it impacts the teacher's stress level and teaching methods?
I think one thing about that though is that it is, the PVOS measures growth. So it isn't just looking at, say, proficiency, it's looking at a student's growth. So that I think alleviates, because you have control over that.
Right.
You as a teacher have a lot of control, not necessarily total control, but you do have control over providing the students with what they need for growth. So that's, it's something that's important to us that it's, while you may not favor necessarily the system, it at least looks at growth and not just proficiency.
That's right.
Right.
Because one of the things we're expecting for all children is that they make a minimum of a year's growth in a year's time. So regardless of where they've started, if they've started here, we want them to at least make that year. If they make more, great. But the starting place is what varies. So somebody may come in as a very high achiever. We still expect a year's growth. We don't want a plateau there. Somebody may come in a little bit lower. We still want a year's growth. So with the teacher evaluation, that's what they're accounting, that year's growth in a year's time, regardless of where that starting point was.
Yeah, but if you have a starting student who's an ELL learner or a student that just simply can't read, and they're already up to 5th, 6th, 7th grade, where they should have been already reading for 5 years, isn't that a little bit ambitious to expect them to have a full year's worth of growth in most classes? If they're not even at the reading level to be there?
Yes and no. In the way that you're asking that question, it is ambitious if we're talking about a level playing field. But what we're talking about is that year's growth for that individual child. So even if they have an area that they struggle in, whether it be English language, whether it's a special education need, regardless of where they started, we still expect kids to grow, not necessarily at the same rate as the person sitting next to them. But if we didn't expect that year's growth, then students would, never kind of close that gap. Even a student who's an English language learner, the longer they're within the culture of English-speaking people, they're going to gain more and more information. So we still expect to see growth. Do I expect to see that at the same rate as somebody who is born here speaking English every day? Absolutely not, but we expect them to always be on an upward trend.
I think one of the things that's come into play through this whole system is the students who are very high. Showing a year's growth for those students, that can be something that may be difficult to measure. So I think that this brings into the conversation a whole nother angle that districts are faced with. It's not just now we're looking at getting students to be proficient, now we're looking at that growth, and that has to happen with every child. So
I don't know, when you asked the question, you mentioned to the two teachers that maybe they have something they wanted to say. So,
there's definitely, you feel pressure, but I'll say prior to that, I always, want my students to show growth, and, I've taught at Cheston and other schools where some of my students were lower ability, but I still always, looked for the growth in them as well. So I think, you want that from your students regardless. Definitely, you feel a little pressure because that part is there. I think that's human nature. But I think, if you're doing your job and, since we have a lot of data and you track your students and try to really tailor that to their needs, hopefully it really shouldn't be a problem.
we had a hand in the back.
Yeah, to follow up with that, when I asked my son about the PSAs or what he has to say to me, we've been told that we're not supposed to say anything. So that's one of the reasons why I came to this, because I can't get the information from him. And I'm not sure how much information the actual teachers have. Are the teachers, now you're saying the teachers are being impacted by the scores, by the way they're actually viewed. How long has that been going on for? And are the teachers able to see at what point their classes and which classes are scoring a specific way, or how much do they drill down on that information when you give that teacher information?
part of what you're asking there with your student coming home saying, I'm not allowed to talk about the test, because part of, I forget who mentioned that, but there are some very rigid assessment guidelines that are expected, almost comical, from who has to sign off because they touched the box, to where the box is stored, to who has a key and who has access, to the state has hired fingerprint analysis to see how many fingerprints are on books. So part of what the students do a little checkbox on their very first day of testing, there is a small blurb on there that says that I, Tracy Piazza, agree not to share the information on this test. Basically meaning that if I need to go to take a bathroom break, I'm not going to go out in the hall and say, hey Bob, question 21 is blah, blah, blah. So, but in an 8-year-old's mind, a 10-year-old's mind, when they hear that statement, which is in pretty legal language, it makes an impact.
So your child can talk to you about it.
And you talk about that. It is pretty strong language. There's also a piece of language in there that talks about when you get our message about no cell phones and technology. The students are told, if you happen to take a picture of this test, that one test question, you send that out over mass media, that could cost your parents $30,000 or one test. So that information is, as silly as it sounds, that is part of the testing protocol that a teacher reads on the first day. So that's where that's coming from.
And sorry, Tracy, we have a protocol that we have to follow in administering the assessment. I was part of it. Angie and I were part of it, disseminating information to test administrators. It has a protocol you have to follow, mandated by the state. My favorite phone call, because we have people we can contact at the state level to ask questions and to receive certain answers that we need. And when I asked the one specific question, the gentleman with whom I spoke said, Bob, we have a forensics meeting on Friday. I'll call you after that meeting. I hung up the phone thinking, forensics? This is amazing. I never heard forensics used with assessments before. And it's so true that books are scanned for fingerprints, but when he mentioned that, I thought, this okay, I get it. This is
So there is definitely a level of paranoia as we're administering tests, because the PDE talks about things like number of erasures and all kinds of very silly things. In terms of your question of does the teacher get to see the assessment, the teacher does not see the assessment prior to opening that book the first day with the children. They get an assessment guide that tells them how they're going to administer. You're going to read this passage, you're going to do this, these are the I can do's, these are you can't do's. So they have that piece of information, but actually viewing the test questions, that does not happen until they open that book with the student. PDE would like us to say that they are just glancing over that as they're monitoring students, that they're really not taking time to read the question. Now I can tell you that, certainly you're looking at, as you're working with children, you're seeing some of those questions. Can you come back and repeat them verbatim? Probably not. Does the state want us to repeat them verbatim? Absolutely not. But that's a philosophical piece in what PD expects versus reality in terms of that. In terms of drilling down into the information generally gets to us in the summer months. So in this given year, if your student is a 4th grader, is that useful to us as a 4th grade student? It's not. It comes after they've completed, hence the summative piece of that. Or I can tell you it is used as a small piece of information as we're looking into the next year. If somebody was below basic, we then may want to take a look at that student as a school team and say, is this child below basic? Do we need to offer something else there, fill in a gap? Or was that a fluke in that particular given test?
I had a list of questions and you answered pretty much every single one, and I appreciate that because this list was also condensed from about 40 questions. So I tried to take the crux of each question that people had submitted to us and asked over the series of about 4 to 6 months, and make them sort of generalized. But the one question that hasn't been answered, and I'm sorry if this will take a little bit of time, is about the alternative form of testing. We have a lot of parents that have reached out to us with students with disabilities or people who have special needs where they're not necessarily suited for the long test day. So some of the parents say that their students take the tests, I guess, during the makeup times, and so we'll go, or maybe I don't know, an opt-out kid goes and has that alternative form of entertainment for the time that the students are taking the test. But one parent was specific about the PASA exams or any other form of those exams, and if there's something like that that this district participates in, and if they could get some information about that.
Sure. The PASA is a test that's used for students that have more significant cognitive disabilities, and the determination as to using that PASA is made by the IEP team for those individual students. And that is made based on the fact that that student would not be able to meaningfully participate in the assessment. But it is not something that can be used for all students that have special education services. It is only something that can be used in very select cases. So that if somebody had a specific question, I would say they should talk to their IEP team about that. But that's something that we're able to use in very select cases.
Is the 504 plan the same thing?
Would not entitle a student to to a pass.
So short of some of the opting out that we've talked about, all students in grade 3 through 4, and whatever other grades as are moving forward, are required to take some sort of assessment. If you're a student who is a typical learner, you're taking the PSSAs. If you're a student who is a extremely cognitively delayed student or have special cases, they would, if they're in 3rd grade, they're still required to take some sort of assessment, and that's the PASA. A big difference between the two is PSSA is generally paper, pencil, or computer-based. PASA is basically a videotape. It's more of an interview, question and answer, back and forth. Many of the students who are taking that have limited verbal capacity as well. So it's some of it is nonverbal, where they're pointing to that, and that's videotaped, and the videotapes are submitted then to the state for grading. But the reality is all students in those grade levels are being assessed in some manner or another, unless they're opting out. Thank you.
Analysis medium. In terms of opting out, is there any, how does it impact the student if they decide to opt out? Is there any, repercussions is too strong of a word, but is there anything that can affect their tracking? Like, so if they're in 4th grade and they opt out, does it impact, I've gotten a wealth of information about, obviously assessments are happening throughout the year. It's a much bigger picture of the child to the teachers. But does the PSSA, by not taking it in 4th grade, impact where they're placed in middle school? Like the tracking?
Let me answer that. There are multiple measures that are used in order to place students. PSSAs being certainly one of them. So if they would opt out, we would still have data on them and make other measures. And I'm of the belief too that if, despite what the teacher recommendations and data shows, that you have a disagreement with that, I certainly think that has to be heard and certainly taken into effect. So those are conversations that we could have with those parents right at the building level. So even though they're on the PSSA score, they have some data from multiple marking periods that we can see. The teachers also, that's why I say to teachers all the time, your input's very important because you work with that child every day. So there are multiple measures. It's not the only one. It is a large measure. We can certainly place students. They are placements. I don't want to say track because it's fluid. It's dynamic. A child can be placed in one type of class, and the teachers would say they don't belong. It should be higher. Maybe they need a little more remediation. And that's where I think we have come in education, and I think it's a good thing that we have those conversations and we have the ability to look beyond just, okay, this is where you're going. All right, we can move kids. It's at times it can be delicate, but I think it's been a great thing for us overall.
The only problem will be what we discussed later is Keystone. Because at some point in time, somebody's going to have to move either to stay on that mark and say you can't graduate, or get off the mark and say you can graduate. you don't take them.
I think I'm missing something with this Keystone High School thing. I was educated in England, and everybody sat the same tests. It was based on end of year exams and also throughout the year coursework to capture everybody's abilities, put it all in the pot, and everybody gets a grade at the end. What is going to happen that last day of high school for the kids who have taken the exams and the kids who have not? How's an employer going to know who to employ? How are the colleges going to know who to take? How is it going to work if some kids are doing it and some kids are not? I don't get it.
Well, that's the real question. None of us do either, and that is the debate and the conversation has to occur because the high school diploma has to mean something, and for
Like it or not, it is an end result. You're either wanted by an employer or you're not. How do you organise those kids at the end of all of this schooling that they're doing, and you throw them out of the gate at the end? Then what?
Well, now the other factor that enters into that is we know the population of students who have been having a difficult time, and we have to even now provide remediation opportunities, ways to help students demonstrate that they are proficient in various things, and so at least that's what we did with the old PSSAs anyway. And so that population of students would be known ahead of time, and I'm sure someone's going to give us direction about what to do. But that is a very, very important conversation that has to occur.
So with those, if you didn't take your exams, you didn't turn up on the day, you didn't get a grade, you don't get a grade. That's it. The last school day comes, and you've got no piece of paper to take to an employer. That's on you. But now you get options of whether you do it or not. I don't get it. It makes no sense to me.
Well, it's America.
Yeah. Don't tell me that.
And, there's respect paid to individuals. Look at Pennsylvania's look at the Amish who have been able to coexist in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and it's a testament to our ability to live together with very different beliefs in life, and when in this country, oftentimes when you're told you have to do something, you can pretty well be sure there's going to be people that say, "Oh no." So that's part of the American landscape, I guess.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Coalition, for organizing this event.
Yes. Good job.
Really, really helpful. Very helpful. There will be a link to the recording.
There will be a link of the recording.
Yes.
I'll share with Mrs. Amelia and
Okay.
let us know how to share.
Thank you.